Okay, let's have a look at one of the oldest debates in studies of risk. Does risk exist? Now, you might think that this is a fairly obvious question, but I'm willing to bet that if we polled a whole bunch of people and got them to really think about it, they would think that it was obvious in quite different ways. For a long time through history, risk was actually considered as just synonymous with probability. And some of the earliest studies of risk looked at risk as really just a question of expected value. So if I have a bet involving $10 and I've got a 50% chance of gaining $5 and a 50% chance of losing $5, then on average my expected position is going to stay the same at $10. That's the sort of calculation that they did. So risk was neither real or unreal. Risk was simply a mathematical calculation of expected value. But over time, risk began to take on the connotations of being about fear and prevention of negative events. And this is where we started drifting into some quite interesting questions about what it means for something to be real or not real. So one of the early distinctions was between risk and uncertainty. So to someone like Keynes, risk was the mathematical scientific side of fear. Risk was something that you looked at when probabilities were known, when you could do careful calculations to work out what the risk was and what the expected value was. And risk was used as a concept to help you make rational decisions. Uncertainty, on the other hand, is dealing with situations where the probability is not known. Uncertainty is driven by animal instincts. Uncertainty is non-scientific and it's emotional. So the reason why Keynes was talking about it was he was saying that stock markets are driven by uncertainty rather than risk. And so you can see where he might come at some of those value judgments. A later way of looking at it was to say, well, there's objective risk and then there's subjective risk. So objective risk is based on facts. Objective risk is risk which can be measured or it can be calculated. And that's really what we're talking about as the correct value when we talk about risk. But objective risk doesn't exist inside people's heads, so we need a second concept we can use to talk about what's going on when people think about risk. And so people have a subjective risk which is different from real risk. Subjective risk is based on intuition. It's the risk that you feel when you feel not quite safe. It's the risk which is subject to all of the different biases and heuristics that people use when they're not thinking correctly. If they were thinking correctly, then they would manage to work out what the objective risk was. And objective and subjective risk would have the same value. One in the world, one in your head. But because people are irrational, then we need to worry about the fact that they don't always get the right subjective risk. So this led to all sorts of studies that tried to measure, well, what is it that causes subjective risk to be incorrect? And people came up with models where there's an actual risk in the real world, and that risk is knowable if we go about it in the right way. And this is what risk analysis experts do, is they use facts and figures and measurements. Now, it's not perfect. You can never perfectly know what the actual risk is, but you can get very, very close, certainly as close as scientific instruments allow. Most people, on the other hand, don't avail themselves of the right information or look at that information in the right way. So they also form a subjective view of risk, but this is prone to many more errors than if they look at risk scientifically. So according to this view of the world, there is a real risk. The real risk is not perfectly knowable, and so it's not exactly the same as expert opinion of risk. But expert opinion of risk gets close enough that we can really talk about real risks as understood by experts and lay opinions and try to understand why those lay opinions differ from the expert opinions. We can study what it is that gets people into fearing certain types of risk. Why are people more worried about nuclear energy than the evidence suggests? Why are people less worried about climate change than the evidence suggests they should be? Those are the sorts of judgments you can make if you assume that there's a real risk, and you assume that science is the best way of knowing and understanding that risk. And we need to understand and correct why lay people don't understand risk in the same way. At the other extreme, we could say that, well, risk doesn't exist out in the real world at all. There's no such thing as objective risk and subjective risk. There's just the risk that happens inside people's own heads. So you fear things. Why do you fear them? Because of the values, what you consider to be harm, what you consider to be important, what you consider to be reliable as a type of information. The experiences you've had. People who have experienced something know something about it. So they're going to have a different view of risk than people who are looking at it without that experience. And information feeds into it as well. And because everyone has access to different information, everyone has, quite rationally, different risks. So risk exists entirely in people's head in this view. And the only real reason for studying risk then is that we can alter people's behaviour by changing what that understanding of risk is, irrespective of whether it matches any sort of outside, supposedly true value, because under this view there is no outside true value. There's a similar position which says that, well, risk doesn't exist inside individuals' heads. Risk is something that we negotiate. And there's different ways of looking at that negotiation. One of the common ways is we could think of it simply as a power struggle, where risk is in fact the language that we use to try to make other people behave in ways that they would like. Why do we talk about risk instead of just making them do things? Because risk comes with a sort of authority that sounds like it's more objective than it actually is. Saying you should stop doing that because I don't want you to do it doesn't hold the same sort of weight as saying you shouldn't do that because a risk assessment says that you shouldn't do that. Or you shouldn't do that because the risks have been judged to be unacceptable. And depending on the way you study this, you'll see the power as residing in different hands. Risk can be used as a weapon for governments to impose their will upon people. Often risk assessments can be used as a way of defending and justifying decisions. Often if those decisions were going to be made in exactly the same way anyway, but the risk assessment gives it an extra tick of approval. Risk assessments can also be a way of people holding higher authorities to account. The language of risk can be very powerful, for example, in industrial relations, as a bargaining position. It can be a way for experts to represent their expertise in a way that can help decision makers. Simply presenting scientific facts is not necessarily helpful in making decisions, whereas presenting those same facts in the form of a risk assessment which evaluates various options can be a way to use expertise to support decision making. Of course, the downside of that is that it can be also a way to represent simple opinion in decision making. Risk assessment can be used as the language to promote the interests, legitimate or otherwise, of interest groups with particular concerns. If those concerns are altruistic, risk assessment is a powerful tool for good. If those concerns are not, risk assessment can be used as a way of closing down decision making or helping people towards decisions that society might prefer that they didn't make. Now, we started this session by asking, is risk real? And hopefully just these few views have given you a broad picture of the debate, which you can examine further in the readings which we've provided. And ultimately the position I'd like you to get to is that none of these ways of looking at risk is complete. They all have their problems, and they all try to oversimplify risk by trying to narrow it down to just a value judgment, or just a way of discourse, a way of talking, or just a technical measurement. The fact is that all discussion about risk is ultimately founded in real-world observations. this is not something which is a complete value judgment. It's something where we're talking about events in the real world as evidence and events in the real world as ultimately what we're worried about. So we're talking about something that is founded in reality. But on the other hand, we're also talking about it, which is a hint that this is not entirely objective either. What we are having is in fact a social negotiation about real objective things. So yes, there are ways that experts make real-world observations and ways in which they talk about risk and ways that they represent risk that may be different from the ways in which lay people do. But there are also ways in which just normal people off the street look at the real world and represent the real world and talk about the real world. And to pretend that that is not influenced by the way in which experts do it would be disingenuous, because a lot of the information we get is filtered through expert representation of information. And to say that the way in which experts talk about it is not influenced by lay perceptions is to pretend that experts are somehow not human and don't have their own experiences and don't have their own values and don't have their own ways of looking at the world. So risk ultimately is a fascinating example of the way in which we start with things which are unquestionably real and which most of us can probably agree we're talking about the same facts and the same potential outcomes. But the talking about it itself is what makes risk so interesting. How do we talk about those things? Which of those things do we value and not value? What counts as legitimate information? Is opinion something which can validly be brought into this debate? And does opinion have the same weight as real-world observations? Or is it a substitute for them? Or is it some lesser form of knowledge? Attitudes towards each of these different things will change the way in which different people who are discussing risk make sense of what risk is, how risk is used, and how risk should be used.